feel free to just unmute yourself and chime in. I'm sure Chase would appreciate that.
Yeah, I definitely work best if you just chime in as we go. I've got a lot to share, but I actually feel like my goal is not necessarily to get through everything I share if we have a better discussion overall. So, I have the stuff to fill the time, but I'd rather fill time with talking about things and learning from each other. So we will go from there, but just one second and I will share my presentation with you all. Goes into that mode. All right, are you guys able to see that?
Yeah, it looks good, Chase.
Cool. All right, so we'll jump right in there and I'll introduce myself because I haven't done that yet. But like mentioned, I'm currently NCBA's Director of Beef Quality Assurance Programs. I've been with NCBA since 2014, so just a little over 6 years now. And all of those years have actually been in the BQA role and have developed more into a leadership role with that program and lead the day-to-day programming for BQA. And so what that entails is working with our BQA state coordinators, working with our states, helping them ensure that they have what they need for successful state BQA programs, and the management of all of our training tools and resources that we have for cattle producers. What it also means is that I work pretty extensively with our larger checkoff team, specifically more over the last couple of years as we've integrated BQA into some larger checkoff and consumer messaging platforms. So I'll talk a lot about that today, how we landed on that, and kind of the science behind those consumer interests in BQA. And by the science, I mean the various polling, surveying, consumer panels that went into thinking about that, where we are with that today. And then I'll wrap things up with kind of some thoughts around how you can best share BQA to consumers when you're talking to them. So my background, I'm originally from California. I currently actually work out of NCBA's Washington, D.C. office. So I moved out here over the summer with my family. My wife's family is from Northern Virginia. So we live up here and work out of the D.C. office. The rest of the producer education team is in Denver, but it's good to have a presence in both of our offices and keeping each other aware of what's going on, across the industry. So I did not grow up on a beef cattle operation. I didn't grow up on a farming operation. My family does have a history in dairying, and we were the last dairy in Santa Clara County. If you don't know what Santa Clara County is, that's actually the county where Google, Apple, and all of Silicon Valley is housed in California. And so our once dairy farm is now a parking lot for Google. No fun there, but it's what evolved in my family. Upon me going to college, I wanted to study agriculture, study animal science. And so I did, ended up becoming the student feedlot manager at UC Davis before going to grad school at Cal Poly, where I studied agribusiness, focused some research on consumer perceptions of beef animal welfare programs and their labeling. So I've been spending quite a bit of time over the last decade or so, understanding what consumers' thoughts are around beef, what their perceptions are of our programs and how we can do better. So I like to think that I have a job that I've been prepared for, and right out of the gate got a job that I really enjoyed and probably would have described as one of my dream jobs. So I certainly can't complain and got lucky. Before that, I was a Washington, D.C. intern for NCBA. So I did spend some time on our policy programs before becoming a checkoff division employee. So that's a little bit about me. And always happy to talk about, what kind of led me down my path. I know, especially for younger or new grads, everybody's wondering how you end up where you do. Lots of people ask me, how they end up at NCBA or things like that. So happy to always talk about those, but you're already doing the right thing if you're attending sessions in the evening to learn more about our industry and what you can do for it. So I'm going to set the stage with a little bit of a consumer landscape and talk about what consumers consider when they're making a protein choice. And so I know that a lot of the news or a lot of the hype is obviously around things like sustainability, around things like welfare, and those might get the headlines in some of those major papers, but people are still considering taste as their number one aspect when they're considering a protein. And we can't forget that because that means we still need to make sure that our product is great tasting. We still need to make sure that our product fits within the budgets of consumers. And those need to continue to be priorities because we can't forget about those things and lose the consumers that are concerned about those things as their top considerations when they're dining out. But what we do see over the last several years gaining significant momentum are those topics that we're seeing in the headlines. Is beef responsibly raised? Do they trust the people that raised beef? And is it environmentally friendly? So those things, while they are lower on the considerations of protein, we do see them gaining over time. So whether that is an aspect of those headlines or those headlines are because these habits are changing, it could be a little bit of both. But as we look at that, those are starting to gain what we consider significant thresholds. They're over a third of people are indicating that that is a consideration when they are dining out, and we see similar trends at home about their protein choices. So that is when we really started to look closely at how we need to start messaging about those things. For a long time, our messaging around beef didn't necessarily start highlighting those aspects. We knew we had positive stories around a responsibly raised product, but we were really targeting or responding to hit pieces or pieces in the media that were not friendly. We weren't taking a proactive approach. And upon kind of reaching these thresholds of 33, 34%, we decided that it was time to start taking a more proactive approach to this. So we started really asking consumers about their perceptions. And in all of our research, we do compare ourselves to chicken. We do that because they're our number one competitor. And it's by a long shot that they're our number one competitor. And we noticed that those perceptions are largely very similar. In fact, with all of agriculture's perceptions, we notice have a very large, what we call a halo effect. It means that when something happens in any one of these livestock species, it has a halo effect on the others. It means that what might happen in chicken negatively can negatively impact beef, even if we're not mentioned in a story, even if we're not associated with a practice. But to the large majority of consumers, they don't necessarily separate out those events from one another. We do notice that we do have a slight advantage in positive perception, but we also have the possibility of gaining more. We have a significant neutral population that if we are proactive, like we've decided to take the approach of being more proactive and talking about BQA and talking about sustainability, which is something we're going to focus more on in the coming year. BQA was something we focused a lot on in this past year. We're hoping that we can gain some of those neutral folks into the positive category there. Some folks are negative and they're always going to be negative. And the chances of converting them are harder, but we need to make our best effort at those folks that have those neutral perceptions. when we ask folks about their concerns with cattle production, far and away their number one concern is animal welfare. This is where things really started to stick out for us and say we needed to bring BQA forward. It addresses a lot of these concerns with animal welfare. It's been an industry standard now for nearly 30 years. And we did not expect for this to be such an overwhelming unaided concern amongst these consumers. We certainly thought with the media attention to things like antibiotics, hormones, and sustainability, that at least they would be somewhat comparable, but they're not. They named animal welfare as their top concern, and that's without us listing these topics. That's them simply writing them out and letting us know that animal welfare is a concern.
Chase, is animal welfare also one of the top concerns for other species?
Yeah, so I don't know if I have that in this presentation, but we notice these similar aspects amongst the other species as well. And to me, I think that was a little surprising because the other species, particularly poultry, spends a lot of effort in talking about no antibiotics. And we did see similar responses about those unaided concerns, or about those concerns with production practices. So I thought that was a little bit interesting personally, but we know that typically when pieces do come out about animal welfare, they usually are, they do have some evidence, or they do have some video footage with them, and they can really have an impactful kind of perception. Also, I think a lot of the media, when it addresses negative things about animal welfare, is coupled with video versus hormones and antibiotics, which are a lot of times articles or pieces that are less hard to visualize. So I think that could be, these are theories from my end, but some of the things we've talked about around the table.
Right. Good points. I was just curious if welfare was more synonymous with confinement, and that we might see that across the poultry and pork also.
Yeah, what I'll actually show you later on is that they're not separating us out from confinement. In fact, I'll show a slide later about how many of them believe that cattle are raised from birth through to slaughter in confinement, and it's dramatic. They really believe that we are raising them in confinement, and it's a huge concern to these consumers. 24% of folks say that they're familiar with how cattle are raised. That's just them saying that they're familiar with it. I don't think that in actuality, if we were to go through and quiz them, that they would be able to explain that. I'll even show here, we did ask a follow-up question to that, asking them to explain the life cycle, and their answers will speak for themselves. The 24%, that's definitely not the number that are familiar, at least with modern production practices. And then you can see the number there that consider how their food was grown or raised before purchasing it. Combined, you have over 70% there, or nearly 70%, excuse me, of folks considering that, which is a big deal, because it means that it is something on their mind, that they want to understand that production cycle when they're making a purchase. And I think we see that in our grocery stores today. We see pictures of local farmers or producers of their vegetables. Sometimes we'll see the similar at the meat counter. So I do think that people across the board are becoming more interested. And, I think our industry has been saying for a long time, we need to share our story. And so it's time that we all take steps to actually do that. we need to take that action and enable folks like you guys to go out there and extend that message further to consumers. I think we can also try to help you guys reach people that are outside your circles, or start reaching into the cities. I think that's one of the challenges amongst advocacy within agriculture, is expanding our circles and getting them into the places that we aren't, and that's hard. So I talked about those 24% that knew how cattle were raised. This is a word cloud of the most common responses when we ask them to tell us about the life cycle of raising beef. The number one response was don't know, followed by things like raised, slaughtered. I think the closest thing we got there was fed, was the closest thing we got to any sort of actual response. But it was pretty evident that there was no consensus as to the life cycle or production cycle of cattle. 43% of those there are the ones that believe cattle were raised in confined conditions their entire lives. And I do think some of that is that halo effect I talked about earlier, from poultry, from swine, reaching over into cattle. I do think it also, folks see feed yards. They see that as an aspect of our industry. They don't understand that it's just a small portion, or maybe one aspect of that life cycle. And so it's a little bit confusing. It's not the easiest thing to share, that a cow might change hands several times and all of that before it reaches the consumer's plate. So I think there's a little bit of confusion there. I'm not sure we'll fully get ever to a true knowledge base, but what we can do is build trust by sharing a message. And I think by building trust, overall, a lot of these concerns can be alleviated. When we asked and dug a little bit into those concerns that I mentioned earlier, things like animal welfare, hormones, antibiotics, when we asked a little bit deeper for what their concerns were about those things, animal treatment / welfare, crowded conditions were the number one thing that they were concerned about there. So that confinement piece, coupled with that concern about animal welfare that I discussed, all of those are tied together. That crowded conditions is something that is permeating into that animal welfare space and what they're thinking about that. When they talked about hormones and antibiotics, their concern there was mostly about their concern in feeding foods to their families that might have these products in them. So continuing to share a message of safety around that is important. One thing, and I won't dive too deeply into hormones and antibiotics messaging in this presentation, but something we have learned over the last couple of years is that a proactive messaging campaign around hormones or antibiotics is not something that tends to go well. I think a lot of times over the last decade, there had been times where, we would share a fact sheet or put out a fact sheet on hormones and shared, there's nothing to fear, that there's so few nanograms of hormones in beef per ounce, etc. What we learned actually is that by doing that, in those that did not have concerns about hormones, we actually instilled more concerns. And in those that did have concerns, we caused them to ask more questions and really challenge those findings or those answers. So what we've learned is to have the resources available to respond to those inquiries, but a proactive approach and say maybe posting on social media proactively about hormones without being prompted, or sharing that message proactively is not necessarily the way to go. And the more advantageous way is to answer those questions and have the resources and information to back up your responses to them, but not necessarily to proactively talk about them.
Chase, I might just add.
Go ahead, Tammy.
We just our Wisconsin consumer survey as well, and interesting point, coming from a state that we think is pretty agricultural and rural based. Of those areas that you have drawn out here on the slide, the questions specifically are the trust in the beef industry, and for cattle are given room to roam, Wisconsin actually ranks lower than the national average, that consumers have trust in, that our cattle have room to roam, which for those of us who are on this call tonight, as we're driving across the state of Wisconsin, we are identifying those cow-calf herds, all over our rolling hills, particularly here in the southwest part of the state, but of course all over. So it's just really interesting when you're asking those Wisconsin consumers that question. And they also ranked lower than the national numbers as far as antibiotics and hormones that are used responsibly. So just wanted to point that out to you, that even though we are an agriculturally based state, we've got a long ways to go in educating our consumers about how we are raising cattle here.
That's good insight to have the specifics in your state, Tammy. So thanks. Right. Continuing kind of with those issues for consumers, and Tammy, chime in if you learned any more about this, but a lot of them, and I think we see this permeated throughout popular culture, is industrial or corporate agriculture versus those smaller family farms. The positive is beef has a ton of small family farms. That's the backbone of our industry. It's the basis, particularly within the cow-calf sector, particularly probably in a state like Wisconsin, where you have smaller herds run by lots of families running cattle. Those have a higher trust factor with consumers, those family farms. To consumers, smaller to them means better. Doesn't necessarily always mean better for the pocketbooks or from a business perspective, but in regards to the consumer trust of the operation, they believe that a small family farm is what they need. They do have a harder time pinpointing what they believe is small, and it actually varies regionally what they believe about that, but I think a lot of that is about perception. But they think those are going away. And so they are concerned about that. But those large scale farms are where they have their issues and their concerns. As somebody who administrates BQA, I can say though that, some of our largest feedlots are best implementers of BQA practices, or they might have the best record keeping systems and the most judicious use of antibiotics that we see in the industry. But to a consumer's eye, they believe that's where the issues lie. And so we need to have a coordinated approach to how we message things. We as an industry probably shouldn't be pointing fingers at one segment or another, because it does take all of us to reach that consumer with our beef. I think a lot of times there's a lot of that inherent trust within the cow-calf sector, but we need to do our due diligence also to educate ourselves about what happens to that animal beyond our farm gate, and where that animal is going, and how that is an important part of feeding our country, but also feeding the global population, is that it takes all of those players put together for that.
Chase, I would say,
nope, go ahead.
that in Wisconsin, that's probably one thing that, as you talked before, of kind of the guilt by association, that for the beef industry, the dairy herds are getting larger and more concentrated and fewer of them, and they see the smaller operations going out, not being in business anymore. That even though the average Wisconsin beef herd, you know, is like you said, your cow calf, that's probably 25, 30, 40 cows at most. As a reputation, and you other guys can weigh in on this too, I think we probably have maybe some misconceptions about what the beef industry is with dairy, not only on size of operations, but also confinement or not confinement, because most dairy cows, you know, are at least a share of the year confined, if not now the large operations that are total confinement. That there's probably a confusion and just the portraying some of the dairy issues or reputation onto the beef industry in the state.
Yeah, Aaron, that's a really good point up here, kind of in dairy land, as I like to call it. We actually have billboards up that have little red barns, and it says happy cows come from fake farms. So on one hand, my husband works for a large dairy, and that, you know, is a paycheck. But for us, that's helped us on our farm because they see the red barn and think it's great. But we also have faced a lot of that of how often are our cows inside and are they in the pasture and things like that. So I think you nailed it on the head, that we kind of get that residual effect from them.
And I would also chime in too, you know, with the state of the dairy industry, a lot of those dairy operations are looking to, you know, find the next phase, and a lot of it has been into the beef side of things. And yeah, I think that does, you know, add another dynamic of advocacy on our end, and understanding, you know, dairy does end up being beef and things like that. But Chase, the one other question I had, in that survey information, were the consumers asked if they've ever been on a farm. You know, I know that's always the $1 million question, as far as you know, their perceptions and reality of what, if they've actually, you know, had that opportunity or not.
Yeah, we did not ask if they have been on a farm, but they're actually screened to make sure that they are not employed in agriculture, if that makes sense. So they may, I mean, I don't know what level of farm, whether they, you know, went to their fall pumpkin patch visit or anything like that. But no, I don't think we asked whether they had been on a farm or not. I don't have any slides on it in here, but interestingly enough, we have learned that farm visits do not always equate to an increased trust factor. So it does with the people, but not always with our practices. So we have found that to be pretty interesting, that a farm tour does not always equate directly with an increased trust factor. But when you're tackling a specific issue, or you really stay focused on a topic at hand, or you have the ability to do that kind of in a more one-on-one setting where you're really explaining what you're doing, I think that's advantageous. But you know, we learned that just farm tours for the sake of farm tours, and I think we noticed that this had an increased instance, particularly within the feedlot setting, but within the feeding industry, they did not always leave with a better impression than they came with. So that was interesting. I think there is still some real opportunity amongst cow-calf operations, ranching, and the like, because like I mentioned, a lot of those already fit those factors that they want to trust, right? They want the smaller, they want the family farm, they want things like that. So I think a lot of it goes back to just being smart about how we're talking about what we do, and smart in selecting where we might be going for a tour and being prepared for those things. Does that make sense? So I'm just going to give a quick overview of how of the BQA program, but I want you all to view this kind of in the lens of why this might be an answer to a lot of those questions. And I'm setting this up so that you have enough background about BQA to remind yourself about how this could answer a lot of those challenges or perceptions that we saw. Because the goal of BQA, it's right in the mission statement, is to maximize consumer confidence in beef, but it is a program geared towards focusing the producer's attention on daily production practices that influence the safety, wholesomeness of quality and quality of beef and beef products. And so the BQA program itself is geared towards producers, obviously, providing training, education, and certification there. But we're trying to maximize consumer confidence, and we can't do that unless we're sharing what we're doing in the BQA program. And so we have taken that to the next level. We've got a really lengthy history that resonates well with consumers. They realize this program has been around for a very long time within the industry. If you're unaware, the BQA program really started to get its foothold in the 1980s when a number of states started creating their own quality assurance programs. In the early 1990s, we did our first national beef quality audit to understand where we were as an industry in regards to things like injection site lesions and defects to the actual meat. Throughout the 90s and particularly into the early 2000s, we were able to significantly reduce those injection site lesions. Today, they're next to nothing. In fact, our researchers really, the amount of money that it takes to do an injection site lesion study to a result of under 1% of finding is extremely expensive. So they actually advise us against really doing injection site lesion studies unless we absolutely need to, or unless we start getting word that there are issues there. We still have issues with meat quality. It's just that BQA evolves to tackle new issues all the time. So a long history there, but what resonates here with consumers is that history, the ability for the program to address issues that are brought up with regard to the safety and quality of beef and address those through the program. The program is led by an advisory group of industry stakeholders and professionals. Veterinarians, producers are a big component of that group. We've got meat scientists. We have representation from the packing industry, animal scientists, and our auction market partners. And then we have our BQA state coordinators who are out there to extend the program in the state to make sure that the program is applicable in the state, to provide context to producers locally, to make it a program that actually means something to the producers locally, and to provide the trainings locally. So we lean heavily on those BQA state coordinators. They have networks of trainers across the country. And it's really the strength of the BQA program is being able to deliver that education through such a large group of folks. So with all of that in mind, we took a look at what the impact on consumers could be if we started to kind of share with them what BQA is all about. We shared with them a description of BQA as a certification program that educates beef farmers and ranchers on best management practices for raising cattle, including care and well-being guidelines, animal handling principles, transportation guidelines, antibiotic use, etc. The program emphasizes responsible cattle management to improve beef safety and quality. We had 5 facts that we shared with them. And in fact, since we have done this, these facts are far and away even better that we could share with them. But at the time, we said 80% of beef cattle are raised under BQA during their lifetime. We talked about BQA's judicious antibiotic use guidelines. At the time, we had over 180,000 verified producers that participate in BQA. Today, we have nearly 400,000. So that's an even stronger number there. hundreds of coordinators and trainers and online training platforms. And then we talked a little bit about that history that we have from the last 30 years. So upon reading the description, their immediate reactions were positive. The #1 response there was good. And so that was something that didn't surprise us necessarily. We had wanted to hear good things about BQA, but the overwhelming response of positivity was not expected at the levels that we got. One of the concerns that folks do have is around verification of BQA practices being implemented. So we continue to look at that, have responses, and I think that's just something across the board that the industry will continue to look at. When learning about BQA, there were a number of things that improved, but here the top 3 were that 70% felt that their beef was more safe, or not more safe. They had more confidence in the safety of their beef after simply reading a description about BQA. 67% were more confident in animal welfare, and 62% felt that BQA represented the meat at their supermarket. Those were really overwhelming responses. So we were super excited about that, and excited that BQA could really, I think personally, the biggest one that I was excited about was that 62% felt that it represented the meat at their supermarket. And we don't have a labeling program with BQA. We don't do any of that, but they felt that this was that deeply rooted in the beef industry that 2/3 felt that it represented the beef that they can buy locally. Overall, it had an extremely positive impact on their perception of how cattle are raised for food. This is probably my favorite chart that we have in regards to consumers and their sentiment. But that yellow line is how consumers felt about how cattle are raised for food before being introduced to BQA. 5% of them were strongly negative about how beef was raised. 13% were negative. 38% neutral. 24% somewhat positive. 20% strongly positive. Afterwards, we shifted that and gained 26% towards the strongly positive and somewhat positive categories, and lost significant numbers in the negative and strongly negative categories. We went from a total of 6%, or excuse me, we went from a total of having 18% in the negative space and moving that needle down to simply 6%. That is a huge shift. And that was when we really realized that BQA could shift a significant portion of our consumers to a positive perception about how we're raising beef. Many consumers were simply happy knowing that a program exists. When we asked them, what do you need more? What do you need to know more about? Their biggest response, or their most common response, was nothing. So that simple 1-paragraph description, a couple of facts, gave them the confidence they needed. You know, a few wanted more information. We provide that on the website, beefitswhatsfordinner.com, which is where we guide them to for more information whenever we talk about how beef is raised, but truly in any of the campaigns that we do, leads them back to that website. And we have more information there. But overall, consumers were happy just knowing the program existed. So got all of this feedback back, developed a video, and wanted to see what their thoughts were. And so I think many of you have probably seen the video, but I will play this and hope that it comes through. If not, you've likely seen it at some meeting over the past year.
Before beef is what's for dinner, it starts out here, which should come as no surprise. What might surprise you, though, is how cattle are treated out here. Thanks, in large part, to Beef Quality Assurance, a voluntary program that focuses on the right way to raise cattle. And more farmers and ranchers than ever have chosen to be BQA certified, because for them, the right way is the only way. Beef, it's what's for dinner.
Sometimes folks can hear the sound, sometimes they can't. So I apologize if you weren't able to. But that was the video that we've shown them. That was the video that ended up becoming a part of our campaign. 18% of consumers felt better about how cattle were raised after watching that video. Similar response to having them read that paragraph, which was very a very cool thing to see. We moved 13% of those neutral folks over to positive, and we moved 5% of folks from a negative view about beef production into a neutral position. So that was very cool to see those shifts move in the right direction. 82% positive sentiment, 92% positive comment in their initial reaction to the video. And one of the cool things is that people watched that video all the way through, and their interest actually peaked at the end, right when we said 85% of beef comes from BQA certified farmers and ranchers. That was the most interesting part to them, which means that all of that effort that we have in getting folks BQA certified, all of that effort that our producers put into BQA certification, that matters. Overall, without that, we can't tout 85% of beef coming from BQA certified farmers and ranchers. So that's an awesome story to tell, and it shows that it matters. Very commonly when you look at folks' interest in videos, it tends to decline over time, but we actually see it peak. When they started to look at what aspects they really liked, animal welfare stood out as the top, and then you can see it trickle down from there. Some of the slogans resonated, but it was nice to see that the animal welfare was where they had that interest, because that was their earlier concerns that we saw. After watching the video, people were able to name beef quality assurance as a program 38% of the time. That doesn't seem like a lot because you guys are aware of the program, but for us to go back after somebody watching a commercial one time and just say, what was the brand for that? And have 38% of people remember it, that's actually a pretty big number. Now, Beef It's What's for Dinner is a brand with a lot of brand integrity. It has an assimilation with some sound, so they noticed that as well at a higher rate. But BQA, this was the first time we've ever had a video to consumers about it. Beef It's What's for Dinner's been around for 30 years advertising to consumers. So we were excited about that awareness after one view of a video. I'm going to skip over some of these things about the National Beef Quality Audit, but as you talk to your fellow producers, if you ever need information to share with them about what BQA has done for the industry or why it's important to be involved, I would encourage you to look at the results of the National Beef Quality Audits, show the improvement that we've made in beef quality as an industry, and use that as a part of encouraging them to participate. Here's some of the pieces that we put together, because when we started sharing BQA to consumers, it is and was a multifaceted campaign. We had advertisements in podcasts. We do things on Instagram and social media. In fact, the most recent iteration is a series of videos where we pair cattle producers with chefs, and a chef spends a day on the producer on the cattle operation, doing things there. And then the cattle producer spends a day in the kitchen with a chef. Those videos have been rolling out this year. That's our kind of most recent iteration of our BQA campaign, and continuing that into new things that reach producers. But you kind of see our messaging around BQA. If you follow Beef It's What's for Dinner, and if you don't, I encourage you to do so on social media. But you'll see BQA kind of integrated into a whole lot of our messaging that is always on and always talking about production these days, more so than ever before. But things for you guys to be aware of as you're sharing the message of BQA, but also of cattle production. Consumers do not understand the beef life cycle, do not expect this, and do not jump into explaining things about cattle production without starting at the very basics. When you refer maybe to yourself as a cow-calf operation, you might have to explain how that fits into the larger cattle life cycle and beef production cycle. Because to them, those words don't mean much. So it's important to put everything we do into context, why it's done, at what stage of the life it's done, and why it has an impact on the beef that's being raised. Videos are very powerful. They don't always need to be professionally done. Sharing videos of you doing daily chores, consumers eat that stuff up. They like to see that day-to-day work that's being done by beef farmers and ranchers. And most importantly, you guys are one of their most trusted sources for information about beef. Oddly enough, the folks that are supposed to monitor the safety of beef and protect our food supply, the USDA and the FDA, they do not trust. It'd be interesting to really take a deep dive into that. I don't think we have, and really take a deep dive as to what they would want to trust, particularly in regards to safety of beef, but they're not their most trusted source. Farmers are, though. Their butchers are also. So, I would encourage you, at your local store, make yourself known to your butcher. Be a resource for them so that they can help answer those questions to the consumers in your area. Online resources or chefs at restaurants, usually where they're having that exchange over the product is who they trust. When you look at who they trust, those are all things that they can put faces with for the most part, or things they interact with personally. Where they don't trust them, they don't get to interact with those folks, or those entities. There's no tangible area to trust there. So I think that's interesting and important to note. When you're thinking about content to deliver to these folks, talk about yourself, introduce yourself, share your role, share that you're a part of their community, that you're a cattle producer, what that means to your family. Talk about how you care for cattle. Talk about what you do to ensure that they're comfortable, that they have what they need, that their needs are met, and that you're doing all that work for the animals. And then, depending on how that story goes, I think you can start addressing other topic areas like sustainability, like how you care for the environment, all of that stuff. But I think those thresholds of gaining their trust and having them trust that you're caring about your cattle are very important. And then to always remember to share what's in it. Well, not what's in it for me, but what's in it for them. There's always that concern. So it's important to understand and tie back to them how that makes a difference, how the practices you do have an impact on the quality of the meat that is delivered to them at their store, how ensuring that what you do keeps that food affordable for them to purchase at the store, et cetera, et cetera. But I encourage you to find out what motivates that consumer personally. So, are they concerned that, wow, beef prices are really getting expensive at the store? It's getting, hard for me to put that on my family's dinner table. Is that what's concerning them? Or is it that they're not able to get certain cuts that they might like? There's resources to address almost all of these questions, but you got to understand what motivates that consumer and then tie that back to what you do and the resources to help them. Similarly, understand your audience, keep in mind what they're concerned about, keep in mind the content that you're delivering to them, and keep in mind about what you should be proactively sharing. I encourage you to match your pictures with your words. And when I say that, I mean, you might be making a post about something specific. See if you have a picture that addresses that. And I'm going to give you some tips here on the next couple of slides too about those photos and some call outs or watch outs there. Again, looking at pictures of you interacting with those animals is important. They really like to see that human animal interaction. We talked about it a little bit earlier about consumers not understanding the production cycle or the life cycle of beef, but I think that also similarly reflects on industry terminology. We have a real instinct sometimes to fall into that because people who are involved in agriculture live and breathe agriculture. We're surrounded around it all day, and also in our personal lives. So we don't tend to always realize that we're using industry lingo, if you will. So, we need to be cognizant and watch who we're talking to and see that what terms we're using are resonating, or whether we need to re-explain that term or try to find another term. A lot of times you might get hung up that, it's not a cow that goes to the feed yard, it's a steer, it's a heifer. To the consumer, if cow is what they understand about it, maybe that's just where we need to be to explain that process, but then go into explaining the different types of animals that we have and their role within the industry. A few watchouts, like I mentioned, I was going to bring up. I would remind you, and you've probably heard this before, watch out from posting pictures of live animals with meat products. It tends to turn consumers off. They want to know how the product is raised. For some reason, they don't want to see that picture of the live animal with the meat product. It has to be really, really thought out. It has to be done in a very precise way if you're going to do that. But I would encourage you to avoid posting those products together.
I have a question about that.
Yeah.
So I guess I'm kind of like maybe hyper aware of how my Instagram feed looks, because you know how it's all laid out when you go to somebody's profile. Sometimes I'll post pictures of like a recipe I made, and I'll do a before shot with all the ingredients and the raw meat, and then I'll do an after picture. But then I'll also be posting pictures of like cows around the farm. Does that matter? Or is it just like in the same post?
In the same post. So each of those posts you make within context, and you have words with them and things like that. Yeah. I don't think like your grid or something like that on Instagram, has to only be one topic. Yeah, just within a singular post. And I think you could even, that may be even a little bit different within, say, an Instagram story, particularly if that's like spread out throughout the day. Like if you're taking care of cows in the morning and feeding them in the morning, but then you posted your picture of dinner at night, like I think they're going to realize that those are different events. But, you know, sitting there with a picture of a smoker right next to your pasture where the cow is eating, might be a realistic occurrence, but might not want to be something like posting like "your next Bessie" type thing.
Okay.
Crowded conditions. I think this, I really like how these two images show how perception is everything here. We could choose to zoom in on all of those cows in the pasture and make that look crowded, or we could show how much space they have and that they elected to be together like that. So that just, you know, can help show one of the big aspects that they're concerned about is, you know, those crowded conditions, and being able to give perspective to that can be a lot. Particularly if you are curating content for consumers, I do encourage you to watch out around animals. Even if you're giving vaccinations, maybe it's more appropriate to simply show a picture of the calf and post with some copy or with some voiceover about your vaccination protocols, and not actually show the practice. But consumers tend to not enjoy seeing us do this. Similarly, they have concerns about squeeze chutes and their role. I wouldn't say that they are against what those do, but again, a picture without any context may cause some consternation amongst our consumers. They look like large metal contraptions, and without explaining what that chute does for you as a cattle producer, providing you with safety, but also calming the animal down and the like, just doesn't necessarily lend itself to positive content.
I have a comment on that squeeze chute piece. So recently, I was doing a farm tour for a woman that I work with who doesn't have much production ag background. And coincidentally, as we were up by the working barn, the guys were freeze branding bulls. And so that while that is not probably the ideal time to host a farm tour, I was able to use that as an opportunity to kind of share a little bit more about the equipment that we use. And it was really interesting for the lady that was visiting, because she had the opportunity to study the animal up closer and ask some different questions she probably wouldn't have otherwise if they were just in the pasture. And what I thought was most interesting was her key takeaway was, I'm surprised you don't squeeze it more to restrain the animal, you know, more while you're working with them. And I thought, well, that's fascinating when you understand how the mechanism works and what it's doing. You know, she just thought from like a safety perspective for both parties, you would maybe really use the squeeze function. So I just thought it was really interesting for me, because I really value kind of getting those adverse perspectives. And that was we made the most out of that situation. So it could have been very different, but fortunately she was really open to that conversation.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to that conversation we had earlier a little bit about farm tours, having the time to work with her, you know, kind of in that one-on-one type setting, and have her interact with what you're doing is very different than saying having a group around that squeeze chute and you just telling them what you do. I think a lot of it too is in that question and answer component. When folks are a part of a group, they're more hesitant to ask a question, whereas if they're one-on-one with you, that's more like a conversation. And it sounds like she was able to really engage in conversation. Speaking of branding, that is one of our bigger call outs. And I know, it's probably not as big of a cultural thing in Wisconsin as it is in the West. But this when I talk about this to many of my friends in California or out west, this is a hard one because branding time is often associated with a lot of the romanticism of ranching in the West, cowboys, horseback, roping, riding, gatherings, the like. Consumers eat that stuff up. But then the second we introduce the topic of branding to them, not so much, right? So, I always like to tell my friends, talk about everything that leads up to it, and then just don't post every animal on your Instagram story wailing while it's getting a branding. And, I think that if we're smart about how we talk about branding, we can preserve that tradition and really that tool for identification for a long time to come. If we are not smart about it as an industry, I think we could lose that tool quicker. Just some additional things, when you talk about, say, animal handling to consumers, that could mean you're just in your pasture moving some cattle. To them, that's animal handling. They like to see you with maybe a bucket of feed, things like that. So when you're thinking about pictures, doesn't mean animal handling, doesn't mean you have to be putting them through a chute, doesn't mean you have to be putting them through a processing facility or anything like that. It's simply just being around the animals. When you're talking about health or welfare, maybe talk about the record keeping or show pictures of how thorough your records are. Show some of that, how cattle use trees as a natural shelter. I don't know if you have natural windbreaks or anything like that on your farms up in Wisconsin, or ways for them to get out of the cold. Things like that would resonate in regards to health and welfare. So those are a few of the watchouts, but also some ideas when it comes to what we can talk about. My action items for you guys, if you're not already BQA certified, encourage you to do that. You're already part of the Masters of Beef Advocacy program, clearly. So you're already well on your way to doing the right things. I just, ask you guys to remain committed to continuously improving what you do each and every day. That matters most. And to share your story. Be confident in the story we have to share, and go forth and do that. So that's what I've got for you guys today, but happy to entertain any questions. I know a little over time here, so happy to chat, but also understand if you guys have things to do.
No worries, Chase. Thanks for a good presentation there. And if you guys have any questions, now's your chance to pick Chase's brain on anything that we talked about today, or anything else you've had on your mind or have been thinking about related to BQA and animal welfare.
I really like the breakdown of, just simplifying some of that terminology that maybe we might overcomplicate in our head compared to what the consumer is thinking. Is that going to be available in our group chat, the presentation and some of those slides?
I can make the presentation available. Brooke, should I just do that through you, or?
Yeah, Chase, if you just want to send it my way, and then guys, I'll post the recording of this too, so we can reference this video anytime too.
Awesome.
Any other thoughts for Chase, guys? All right, thanks a bunch, Chase, for hopping on and taking some time to chat with us tonight about BQA. We appreciate it.
Yeah, I appreciate you guys, and you feel free to reach out anytime if you have questions or need resources. And Tammy always knows how to get a hold of me.
Will do. Awesome. Thanks. And then guys, just for next week, we're talking about nutrition. So it's actually 2 continuing education lessons. It's number 3 and number 5. So if you guys have any questions about those or next week, you know how to get a hold of me in our Facebook group or my email or text or whatever. So with that being said, I'll let you guys get back to your Monday nights and have a good rest of your week. And thanks for hopping on.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Chase.
guys.
Hey, everyone.
Thanks, Chase.